and we begin by queering up the road to Stonewall. Research shows Nazi persecution of transgender people. Historians are discovering and releasing more evidence that the Nazi regime set their sights on the trans community as well as gays and lesbians. A German court recently acknowledged the possibility that trans people were persecuted by the Nazis. Judges took expert statements from historians and essentially acknowledged that trans people were victimized by the Nazi regime. It was the first time a German court acknowledged the possibility that trans people were persecuted in Nazi Germany. Afterwards, the Bundestag, Germany's parliament, formally recognized trans and cisgender queer people as victims of fascism. Up until the past few years, there has been little research on trans people under the Nazi regime. Before Hitler came to power, trans folk were issued transvestite certificates to exempt them from cross-dressing laws, and they were also a force in the cultural community. And while, again, there's a lot to go on here. First, I want to just clarify that transvestite certificates was actually a progressive thing at the time. So let's, make sure that we say they were turning back the clock. And we all know, and rightfully so, that Jewish people were persecuted, union members were persecuted. The Nazi, anybody who wasn't a Nazi was essentially persecuted. And and so the fact that it's taken decades before we've even really started to get substantial scholarly research on this is a shame, but I'm going to say good now that we're starting to get it.
Well, I don't mean to interrupt you, Dale. No. If we go to the Holocaust Museum in Washington, D.C., inside the museum there is a standard year-long exhibition called Nazi Persecution of Gay LGBTQ plus community, because the Stonewall Library hosted a traveling version of that back in 2005, which I instigated.
Oh, wow.
So on those boards, what's important, and in that display, what's important is to see how the Germans laid the foundation for all the persecution that we're now dealing with in terms of stereotypes and in terms of, the so-called bad things that the LGBTQ plus community brought. They do mention transgender people in this traveling exhibition, so I'm sure if we went to the Holocaust Museum in D.C., there'd be some mention of it. But it's important that Germany take that important step as a country and discuss it further, because at this point it was always like a sub note, that yes, because they weren't Aryan and they weren't blonde, blue-eyed and could make babies and fight, they were persecuted.
Right.
Yeah, well, and we've talked about how conservative Republicans are basically borrowing Nazi ideology and putting it into practice. Well,
that's being polite.
They're putting it into practice and beginning with their attacks on the trans community. And as we said, we all know what happens to the Jews, to the queer people, the union members. Yes,
it's great that there are just so many things bringing this into the light. That's what's so important, because as we were saying, our siblings are the ones who are being most persecuted all around the country right now, and not just in this country. And things like El Dorado, which was a fabulous documentary which is referenced in this, which tells the story of this ongoing in Berlin, how prevalent transvestites, the terminology at the time, were, and then suddenly Hitler comes into power and everything changes.
And in the 20s and 30s, Berlin was the gay destination of the world. It was the most open, it was the most accepting, it was the most exciting period for the LGBTQ community in that time of the world.
If I remember correctly, I vaguely remember reading, there was a lot of research on homosexuality and what we now call transgenderism, and it all got burned with the book burnings. Am I remembering that correctly? Because this is all new to me. I mean, I know the history of the pink triangle. But this is new to me, like as of when I got the story yesterday.
Well, it's new to a lot of us. Like I said, there hasn't been, yes, there has been some, obviously, because it's at the museum, but not enough.
No.
Because, you can fill binders, you can fill books with the information that we don't know, much of which has probably been lost to history because it was either burned in 1944, 1945, or just it's buried, Raiders of the Lost Ark style in some, dank British building collecting dust.
But that's why the Stonewall Library and One and Pulse are so important around the country, because that's where you get your gay history.
Mm-hmm.
And I really am excited that these libraries and museums are doing the outreach that they're doing. But we always have to encourage the youth, and we always have to remind people that, gay pride is not just about beer and shirtless men and women. It's about, talking about our history and celebrating the challenges and trials that we've gone through.
Well, especially since we're coming up on Gay and Lesbian History Month in October.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
Know your history, and like you said, buddy, you don't need a lot of ink in your pen to draw the line and connect the dots between what happened in the mid-30s in Nazi Germany to what is happening in many states, most states of the United well, I'm talking about of what's happening in the United States.
It sort of proves the point. Everything old is new again.
Exactly.
Yeah.